Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and to share some thoughts about what difference would it make if there were more women in politics. Why does it matter? And the first point I think I would make is that I think that one of the differences it would make if there were more women in politics is that there would be a greater chance of people re-engaging with the political process. And I say that because we have a representative democracy, so-called, but of course it's a democracy that doesn't actually represent the rest of society. It doesn't look like the rest of society. And we can see that in the figures that you just heard from Cherry in terms of the fact that women are only 21-22% of Parliament. It's the same, obviously, also for ethnic minorities, for people with disabilities, I mean, in a whole range of ways, and indeed people that aren't millionaires. All of those people, look at Parliament, they look at the people who are supposed to be there on their behalf, and if they don't look and feel like people that we know and feel like us, then I think it's more likely there'll be this chasm that I believe there is between the political classes, if you like, and the people that we're meant to be representing. And so I think, irrespective of whether or not, and we'll come to this, whether or not we think more women in politics would lead to more women-friendly policies, putting that aside, I just feel that in order to have a better chance of people re-engaging with that political process, if it looked a bit more like them, if they could see themselves there and feel a bit more relevant, some idea that the experience of the people at Westminster had something more to do with the experience of most people in the country, then I think that might just be the start of helping us to re-engage with people again. Because I think after the expenses scandal, after so much where politicians are held in such poor repute, really, there's an awful lot of work to be done to heal that chasm. And I would argue very strongly, particularly from my political persuasion perhaps, that it matters that people have faith and confidence in the political system, because certainly if I look at the big changes that my party would like to see on politics, it's going to need quite a lot of state intervention. And if that state intervention is to be accepted and supported and promoted by ordinary people, then they need to have confidence in it. So my first point would be, irrespective of whether or not we believe that more women in politics would lead to more women-friendly policies, if we have a representative democracy, then it should be representative. That's the bottom line in terms of actually our relations with people in Parliament. Just to add as well, sorry, just to say, as Kerry already did, that of course we are doing spectacularly badly at that. We're actually behind countries like Afghanistan and Rwanda. We're the same as Malawi in terms of our percentage of women politicians. So we've got a huge way to go. David Cameron, back in 2009, before he was Prime Minister, promised that he would make a third of his cabinet, a third of his government ministers women. In fact, it's only 19%, and just 4 women currently at the moment in the cabinet are women. So coming then to the process and the political outcomes, the policies, how would they look different if there were more women in politics? And on the policies themselves, the first thing I would say, and it's fairly obvious, but I think it is worth saying, that more female politicians doesn't automatically lead to more women-friendly policies. And if you're in any doubt, then I would just suggest looking at people like Nadine Dorries on abortion or Margaret Thatcher on just about everything. But I think it does increase the likelihood that issues that are more likely to be of concern to women will be prioritised. And I'm aware that in everything that I say in my sort of 4 or 5 minutes ahead, they are generalisations, and I apologise for that. But I don't suppose now is the time to get into the big debate about nature versus nurture and how much of women's different experience in our culture is what makes us approach things differently to the extent that we do, and how much that's in our genes. We can leave that perhaps for another debate on another day. But I think it's certainly the case that certain outcomes are more likely if you have more women in the room, as a result, not least of the different experiences that we bring to the table, being people who are more likely to be involved, for example, with bringing up children and so on, but not exclusively that. But I would make the case that the absence of more women politicians makes it more likely that we get policies that, for example, perpetuate women's economic disadvantage. And just looking at some of the facts of the nearly £15 billion worth of cuts that we've seen so far from this government, 3/4 of those have been specifically at the expense of women. Of every 10 jobs that were lost in the last quarter to March, 8 out of those 10 were lost by women. We're in the midst of a record 25-year high of female unemployment. Cuts to public services in particular, I think, deliver a kind of a triple whammy for women. First, because women are disproportionately represented in public services in terms of employees. So as the government cuts public services, then women are particularly badly hit. But of course, women also tend to depend more on public services, and so they are hit again in that respect. And when those public services have gone, then it's more likely to be women who have to fill the gap, for example, in terms of looking after elderly relatives or whatever. And I find it hard to believe that the degree of disproportionality of those cuts would have happened in quite the way that they have if more women were there at the House of Commons. And I just wanted to pay tribute, actually, to the Fawcett Society for everything that you've done in terms of holding the coalition to account on the issue of doing gender equality impact assessments and so forth. Yay! In places like Iceland, where nearly half of MPs are women, I think it's interesting that there's been a kind of a shift whereby women are now trusted more with economic decision-making because there's an association with women perhaps thinking more long-term and less for the short-term. Iceland also the first country in the world to ban stripping and lap dancing for feminist rather than for religious reasons. You can never draw an exact cause and effect, but I think we probably could say it's more likely to happen as a result of the fact that you've got more women in Parliament, which has resulted in that. Would I go as far as to say that if there had been more women MPs, would we have had a better regulation of the financial industry, prevented the current economic crisis? No, I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the case, but it is just possible that women's general capacity to listen a little bit more and to spout off a little bit less, they might have listened more to some of the advice that was coming in, some of the commentators who were predicting that we were aiming and ending up with a likely economic catastrophe. Statistically, you can show that women are more likely to vote for parties that advocate action on things like prioritising public health, concern about the environment, climate change, and so on. And again, we can hypothesise about why that should be the case, but certainly that's what the figures suggest. So I think that when it comes to the actual political outcomes of having more women in politics, one can't be definitive about it, but one can say certain outcomes are more likely given that you've got a great diversity of experience in that political decision-making process. But in fact, it is the process that I wanted to come on to next, the process of politics, not just the policies of it. And there I think we can speak with greater certainty, really, about the difference that having more women in politics would make. And I say this feeling that I've kind of experienced both sides of it in a way. I've been in a local authority, I've been in the European Parliament, and now at Westminster. And certainly something I would say about being in the European Parliament was there you've got about a third of MEPs are women. But in many committees it would feel more or less 50-50, and some of them probably were. And actually what you realise is that you're just forgetting about gender. You're not aware of it. You're not thinking about it specifically as you just walk around the building. It's not something that you're mindful of. And I simply could not say that's the case when you're walking around Westminster. You are very obviously, I feel, very obviously in a minority when it comes to debates, when it comes to committees and so forth. And that just isn't a particularly pleasant feeling, I guess. And clearly as well in Westminster there's so much more overt sexism, and it's not just the calm down dear and the continuing focus even today on things like the size of women's breasts and what they're wearing and so on. I mean, sitting in PMQs, Prime Minister's questions, and hearing, you don't always catch it actually on the radio and TV, you can't hear all of the mutterings that are happening all around when other people are speaking. But there's still a vast amount of sexism which people do without expecting to get challenged on it, and it just makes you feel less comfortable than you would do otherwise, and it feels that your views are therefore taken with less seriousness. Just to compare with that, I was at a conference not so long ago on climate change, and the woman who had organised the conference had decided to, without making a song and dance about it, but she just made sure that every single speaker in a day conference was women. And she did that because she said she was so fed up of going to conferences where the most qualified person to speak on a subject would more likely than not be a woman, but they'd be in the audience and not on the panel. And I just don't think we can overestimate the sense of what that felt like being in that conference with lots of women. And it felt less competitive, it felt more honest, it felt more... it felt less grandstanding. People talk about big willy politics, and it felt like the opposite of that. It felt like we were talking about things on a more equal basis. I've just been passed a note saying 2 minutes. So let me just say a couple more things about the process of what would make Westminster different. Just to give you one example, actually, the first thing that happens when you become an MP, you don't get an office or a desk or a computer for weeks, but what you do get is a pink ribbon to hang up your sword with. So that will be a great consolation to you all, I'm quite sure. But that is seriously true. You still get your pink ribbon to hang your sword on. But things like changing sitting hours, well, we've had a small victory, and praise should go to Joan Ruddock, actually, because she really was instrumental, along with a number of other women, in changing some of the sitting hours. So at least on a Tuesday now, we don't have to sit through till 10:30. We can finish at 7:30, which is all very nice. Voting. We waste vast amounts of time, 250 hours in the time of an average parliament, I calculated, just waiting to vote, because you have to go through the aye lobby and the no lobby, and it just takes forever, and it's deeply inefficient. And I just sense from other women who are kind of grumbling about it as I am, that sort of sense that this time-wasting ritual, which is of no consequence or purpose, is a waste of time and needs to be changed. I think there are opportunities there for things like introducing job sharing for MPs. But when I raised that in a conference speech that I gave a few years ago, the response from the Daily Mail et al. was somewhat horrified. You know, you'd think I'd sort of predicted the end of the British Empire or something. But anyway, I think there is plenty of scope to make Parliament, the process of politics, more cooperative, less Punch and Judy, grandstanding, and I think that will be more likely to attract more women. The European Parliament is one example of that. The Welsh Assembly actually is another example of that, where over 40% of MPs are women. I'm sure there must be only 1 minute left. So all I would conclude by saying is that I guess that the bottom line that we could all agree on, I think, is that if there were more women in Parliament, it would be different, because you would have a greater diversity of experience in that decision-making chamber. And as we all know, diversity is the key to survival and resilience, and so it's a very important thing. I think both men and women, as Kerry said earlier, are entitled to and would benefit from a better, more representative democracy. Having more women in Parliament perhaps doesn't sound like a particularly radical change, but to the dinosaurs that inhabit Westminster, I promise you it is. And so I hope you will take comfort, as I do, that we all know what the fate of the dinosaurs was.
I'll just give our next speaker a moment to set up her technology. So that was fantastic, a tour de force. So I think a kick-off, a starter for 10 in the debate, with Caroline saying, well, more women at the table would make us our democracy more effective and more representative. Caroline is positing we would have better and more effective policies for women, probably, though she's not claiming a direct causal relationship. And in particular, she thinks better economic policies. And finally, she's saying the process is better, less big willies, less pink ribbons, and perhaps a bit more cooperation, but she's not being essentialist honest. So, okay, but so thank you very much. And so I'm very pleased to now introduce Dr. Ruth Seeley, who's going to speak perhaps more corporate perspective, but of course you may want to start to respond to Caroline, should you wish. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for asking me here this afternoon. I am now an academic, so I can't go anywhere without data, so I'm afraid I do have just 4 or maybe 5 slides. So I work at Cranfield School of Management, and since 1999 we have been monitoring the representation of women on corporate boards, the main corporate boards, so the top FTSE listed companies. And when I'm talking about business, I am just talking about the big corporates, the investment banks, the professional service firms and the law firms, because that's the area that I work in. So I don't profess to know, to have all the knowledge about the thousands of SMEs that we have in the UK. But as I'm sure a lot of you know, we have appalling representation in these positions of power. And since 1999, when there were 6.9% of FTSE 100 board seats which were held by women, over the next decade, that figure increased to just around 12%. So just a 5% increase in 10 years, which was very slow, very tiny, little incremental, 0.5% here, 0.5% there. And then it plateaued for 2 or 3 years, so that was very depressing, having to write that every year. And there were all sorts of phrases around like glacial progress, and it'll take 73 years to reach parity, and a snail could crawl around the M25 faster than we were going to get there, which I never got because, of course, it's going to get squashed. So anyway, so the government then put together, fast forward to 2010-11, the government put together the Lord Davis review, and in February 2011 a report came out which had some very specific recommendations that didn't tell the women to do anything different, but looked at the other stakeholders involved in getting more women into positions of power. And since then, we've had quite incredible progress, as some of the figures that you can see up on the board there show. And we now have a figure of 17.5% of women on the top 100 corporate boards. We've made a 5% increase in 18 months that it took a decade before to do. So that's really quite exciting from my perspective, being the academic. We've reduced the number of all-male boards from 21 down to 8. More than half of those companies have more than one woman on the board, and more than a quarter of them have the sort of elusive 3 or more women on the board. So quite excited by that. But the figure that really gets me going, tell you all riveted, is the other thing that we measure is the pace of change. So every year a certain number of board seats turn over, and we've been monitoring, well, how many of those new seats go to women? And previously the figure was tiny, which was why we were having incremental increases. But as you can see, again, from the chart behind me, that figure has really increased. And Lord Davis in his report said, right, in order to make any substantive change, we need 1/3 of new appointments every year going to women. And at the time that was sort of quite audacious, because imagining that chairs and executive search firms were only going to give 2/3 of new board seats to men was quite shocking. But we really have seen some behavioural change there, and now 1/3 of the appointments are currently going to women. And what this means, if we sort of take this forward with a trajectory, taking into account the turnovers and men and women coming off, and the percentages of men and women going on the boards, is that quite quickly we can make some good progress, so that by 2015, the bottom line is if we stick at 25% of new appointments, a quarter of all new appointments going to women, by 2015 we would have gone over 20% and would hit 27% by 2020. If we keep at our current pace of change, which is over 1/3 of new appointments going to women, then by 2015 we'll be over 26% women on boards, and by 2020 we could be approaching 40% of women on boards. So, you know, that is really quite optimistic, and it feels a very exciting time at the moment after a sort of decade of rather depressing figures. However, let's not get too carried away. We're still only talking about 17.5%. When women make up half of the workforce. They've been overachieving, whatever that means, at school for a number of years. And for at least 2 decades in some professions like medicine and law, women have been the majority of graduates. And I spend a lot of time wading through annual reports, and believe you me, this is still a very, very normal picture to see, even when companies are claiming that we have addressed diversity within our organisation and have ticked that box. So, given that we're talking about power, whilst we can get excited about the fact that we've got 17.5% of women holding those seats, if you break it down into the executive seats and the non-executive seats, the executive seats are the positions that actually hold the power within the organisations and run the organisations. On the non-exec side, we're up to about 21-22%, so that's quite encouraging. But on the executive side, it's still only 6.5%. In 2012, we still only have 6.5% of women holding the positions of power. There were 44 new executive directors appointed in the 12 months to September. Guess how many went to women? Precisely 0. So we're not making any impact on that. So the Davis report has made an impact, but not enough yet. And I did think it was very poignant this week when Marjorie Scardino, who was known as the first woman of FTSE because she was the first female CEO, stepped down and said that 15 years ago when she took up her position, she really thought it was going to change. And it hasn't, because she only leaves behind 3 female CEOs in the FTSE 100. So my question was, well, why hasn't it changed? And if you look at that a little bit differently, you could ask, well, why is it changing now? What is it now that's bringing about change? And I think it's very definitely a confluence of events, and one of them is definitely the global financial crisis, which I think has allowed people to start questioning the perceived wisdoms and logics of the way things have always been done around here. Awareness of drip-feeding information and awareness of the fact that it is not changing counterintuitively it is also a fact. And the fact that we now have a growing number of men and women at a senior level who are realising en masse that this is a structural issue and it's not down to individuals making choices or not. What's the rationale and incentive for getting more women in positions of power, aside from the gross inequality? For me, it's just a massive waste of talent, a massive, massive waste of talent in terms of underutilising highly educated, highly experienced, highly professional women in this country. It's a complete waste of money, for a start, to bother educating all of these women up to a certain level and then not using them. And the economists have done all sorts of, you can add 15 billion to your economy by fully utilising talent. For me, it's a much more individual perspective in terms of the personal cost of an individual not being able to fulfil their potential. To what extent did the gender imbalance contribute to the institutional crisis? Enormous, absolutely enormous. I was doing my PhD across 6 investment banks in 2006, 7, 8, before it all imploded. And one of the banks I was working in was Lehman's. And I remember saying how shocked I was at a lot of the information I was getting from these female managing directors. And 2 things really struck me. One was how one woman said, anything other than nanosecond conversations are banned in meetings. And you think, okay, so what's the point of a meeting? Are you going to discuss anything at all? No, nanosecond conversation. And the other one was that a woman said for a number of years now she had not been promoted because she was slammed for looking after her team, i.e. not being individualistic enough. And I think those are 2 quite, and again, not to sort of to generalise, but I think those are 2 areas where women would bring a substantial difference. What are the weaknesses of the sector at the moment? I think the figures just give it away. How can we possibly believe we have a democracy, anything approaching democracy, when only 6% of the executive power is held by women? How can you possibly believe you have the best person for the job, which is the usual trot-out statement, when half of the talent is being excluded? We're lucky we do have a critical mass now of women up there, and I think this is why change is happening, who not only are fed up of not progressing, but also getting angry and realise there's enough of them getting angry. And I think the powers that be are beginning to realise that there's a swell of women getting angry and are heading towards it. Possible means of change? I think we are, I would like optimistically to believe that we are at the beginning of a gentle revolution. I'm sure one thing that may well come up in conversation is the issue of quotas, and all I'd say at this point is the threat of quotas has had a massive impact in the last 2 years. My vision of a more gender-balanced corporate power, management teams and boards would make better decisions because they'd move past nanosecond conversations. There'd be better adherence to corporate governance. We know this from research. Less insolvency, greater innovation, greater creativity, less groupthink. Interestingly, as Caroline was saying, it would look more normal. It wouldn't look like that. It would look more normal. And we know from research that when you have gender-balanced cultures, both men and women are free to engage in both masculine and feminine behaviour. So it becomes more normalised. And sex will always be an issue in the workplace, but gender ceases to become an issue in the workplace. And just so winding up, businesses would understand that without human reproduction there is no business. They would also understand that it takes both a man and a woman to produce a child. Individuals of both sexes would feel that they could fulfil their potential, and businesses themselves could really believe that they have got the best people at the top. And through all of this, I would be very, very happily out of a job. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ruth. It's quite exciting to have a Dr. Ruth on there. So thank you, for that tour de force. I mean, so wonderful to have all the stats and the facts as well, but clearly no longer having glacial process, so we can get quite excited. 40% of women on boards apparently by 2020 in some areas. Interesting what you said about the Lehman. So you'd be agreeing with Harriet Harman, if there had been Lehman sisters, perhaps they wouldn't have had the same.
Lehman brothers and sisters.
Lehman brothers and sisters, yes, that's right. And interestingly, though, I think ending up in some ways where Caroline was in terms of this notion that women are more gentle and cooperative and thoughtful, maybe something to pick up again later on as to we're saying that men can't be. But I'm sure that maybe Mary might have something to say on that, or maybe not. So yes, I'll just hand the floor to Mary to say your piece on the media, and of course feel free to respond.
Kerry, thank you very much. I'll try and be brief because I know Kerry will be eager to take questions from the audience. I should just say that I do wish that I could lay claim to have edited Woman's Hour, but unfortunately I haven't. I was deputy editor of Today, but not the Radio 4 programme, the newspaper that Rupert Murdoch bought from Eddie Shah, founded it originally. And Murdoch bought it and closed it, I think, one Tuesday lunchtime in a typical gesture of male autocracy. He sent one of his minions down to close the newspaper, and that was that. Could I just at the beginning, too, add my own tribute to Fawcett and to the work that all of you have done when the coalition government, as Caroline has said, are imposing cuts that are so blatantly directed at women and at children. I think it's hugely important that not only politicians and the media, who are very bad at it, but also organisations like Fawcett hold them so very well to account. So that, I think, is very appreciated. I'm in a way echoing the two other speakers because I am here to tell you that there aren't enough women in the media. I think there's now one woman editor in national newspapers, who's Dawn Neeson at the Daily Star. Rachel Baer edited the Sunday Times and the Observer simultaneously, as far as I can make out, in the closing years of the 19th century. So that is a pretty dreadful record. At all levels, men make up the majority of journalists in the UK. 3/4 of all news journalists are male. Women are only 1/3 of the business and politics sector. Even among lifestyle journalists, 49% are men, 70% in the arts. The Daily Mail and the Observer have the highest ratio of women, 36% each. And my newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, has 26%. But I can tell you that it doesn't always feel like that. When I'm sitting in the editor's afternoon leader conference, there's frequently only one other woman, if that, in the meeting. And that imbalance isn't peculiar to the Telegraph. When I sat at the equivalent meetings at the Daily Mail and the Observer, it was a very similar picture, which gives rise to several questions. Why is there such a lack of women? What effect does that have on news coverage and the portrayal of other women? And last of all, and most important, I think, to what we're here to talk about this afternoon, with Lord Leveson about to report, has the male culture of the media led directly to phone hacking and to the abuses that may now, in turn, lead to statutory regulation? I've spent my whole career in the media, partly as an executive, but also as an interviewer, feature writer and columnist for a number of titles. I was once Marge Proops's assistant on the Daily Mirror. I don't know which of us thought that was the worst idea. And I've also reported from Africa, from wars in Sarajevo and Afghanistan. So in other words, like most women journalists, I've covered a certain amount of the waterfront, and I can honestly say that I've never encountered any overt sexism. I was struck by Caroline's stories of life in Westminster. Of course, life in the old media used to be rather similar. I was reading a piece that Anne Robinson had contributed this morning, in which she said that men were defined, or some men were defined, under the labels NST and NSL, which stood respectively for not safe in taxis and not safe in lifts. And so, which rather speaks to the sort of behaviour that Caroline was talking about, that I think is now sort of very much part of the past in the media. And, you know, I have nothing but praise for my male editors and colleagues who've given me many of my best chances. So on to the question of why aren't there more women. I think in postgraduate entries to the trade, to the profession, which is perhaps the most common route in now, is about equal, but women fall by the wayside after that for obvious reasons. One is that the news machine never stops. You know, at least Parliament winds down for a bit every day, whereas the 24/7 newsroom is exactly that. It just carries on. So life there isn't always, or sometimes even ever, conducive to bringing up young children, which affects men as well as women. I've got lots of young male colleagues who've suffered from stress-related illnesses and so on, just through the pressures of trying to do their fair share of childcare and so on, and hold down a very long hours job. And I think, of course, it's male bosses with very few domestic pressures who set the climate, the tempo, call the culture. There's somebody at home who'll iron shirts and get their dinner on the table if they ever come home, and so on. Then there's the question of how that affects the media content. A UNESCO report has described the common images of women in the media as the glamorous sex kitten, the sainted mother, the devious witch, the hard-faced corporate type, and the political climber. That's UNESCO, and I'm afraid there is some truth in that. The Daily Mail exemplifies a sort of pantomime horse syndrome, where you've got the front end of the paper, which is full of this quite right-wing, hard news agenda, some strident commentary, and then the back end, which is full of much gentler features designed to appeal primarily to women and so on. That's a successful formula. The Mail makes a lot of money. The Daily Telegraph, my paper, makes some money. The Times and The Independent are struggling, and The Guardian, I think, is headed for bankruptcy. The print industry is slowly, more or less slowly, dying, and the Leveson report will be produced into that climate. It would be facile to say that the disasters uncovered by phone hacking wouldn't have happened, the inquiry rather, wouldn't have happened if there had been more women in charge. A woman, Rebecca Brooks, is at the centre of the allegations, and she will stand trial to in due course to answer the charges against her. Malpractice is, to some degree at least, gender neutral. The bulk of journalists in this country, like all ordinary citizens, male or female, find phone hacking as repugnant as I'm sure everybody on the panel does, and everybody in this room. I had no idea that such practices went on, nor did the vast majority of journalists I know, male or female. But the abuses were, I accept, part of a macho culture in which the ends, however venal, justified the means, however vile. And I think that phone hacking could only really have grown up in a strange sort of bubble world, dislocated from real life, from social norms, from moral values, from the sort of world where people have to get the kids ready for school, get the washing through, you know, where you're just dealing with sort of normal pressures. So a world that was totally dislocated from respect for the individual and for the law. And I think the maleness of that bubble world did have an effect. But I'd also suggest, and many of you might disagree, that the maleness of the response also contains hazards. From Lord Leveson and his very brilliant QC, Robert Jay, to the hacked-off campaigners such as Hugh Grant, there aren't very many women's voices to be heard. I don't want to prejudge Leveson. I deplore phone hacking and the harm it caused, but I also worry that a backlash may lead to statutory regulation and a press that's more muzzled not only in relation to unsavoury stories, but also when it comes to exposing real outrages. This week, we've seen two extraordinary scandals emerge. One is Lance Armstrong and the Tour de France doping dossier, and the other is the Jimmy Savile case. It seems to me that the cheats and the abusers of the future, including those accused of preying on women and girls, are even less likely to be challenged by a less free media. The media is facing revolution in terms of delivery, as print's overtaken by technology, and also in terms of regulation. And I think women absolutely need to be at the heart of both those changes. They've been betrayed and belittled by the old-style media, and often still are. But I think to dilute the freedom of the press would serve the interests of no one and serve the needs of women least of all. Thank you.